Stories have transcended times and places and mediums. In virtual reality, we're going to learn how to tell narrative stories in VR and how we're going to use story to engage our audience in new ways. So let's start with understanding what is narrative and how do we do narrative storytelling. There are lots of narratives that are told throughout our world and in our society. Even brands have narratives. So Coke has been telling a story for a long time, and I want you to think about what is that narrative? Well, Coke is trying to convince you that life is better with a Coke. And so I typically ask this question to the class, is that true? Is this narrative that life is better with a Coke, does that really come true? And typically there's a little bit of debate back and forth, and there's typically a master student who is really confident in their answer, and they tell me that that is not true, that it is just a bunch of advertising, and that it's basically a story that's made up. Well, this is the point where I go from behind my desk, I pull out a cooler of glass bottle Cokes, and I start popping them while I'm playing the Coke song that you hear in all the commercials, and everyone has a smile on their face. The whole room changes. And you can't deny the fact that class just got better because the professor just pulled out 30 Coke bottles. Okay. So they have a narrative they've been telling. Now the question is would that have been the case where you would have thought it was so enjoyable that you smile when you realize you're going to have class with a Coke because they've told the story this way, or is the Coke that good? Right? And I think it is actually both, right? They're not telling a story that doesn't work with their product, but they're telling a story that has convinced us over time. And they have done this for a long time. So we can look back at vintage Coke ads where it's all about that life is a little bit better when you have a Coke. And now on YouTube, there are so many videos of Coke's commercials where they just try to make it feel that life is a little bit better. So that's their narrative story. They're doing that in an advertising way. But we see stories in lots of different ways. And so I want to ask the question, what is narrative? We're in a journalism school. This is kind of one of those understood things. But then when I talk to students, I realize they don't have a clue what we mean when I say expand the narrative or work on that narrative story. So let's get into what is the narrative. Well, story is part of narrative and narrative is part of story. So let's separate the two. When we talk about story, we're talking about an account of events. There are things that go on, and there are things that happen, and there are people and places, and something happened, and there's an account of events that connects all of these things together. We typically call that a story. Oftentimes, they're told in chronological order. Okay? But a real story must have a beginning, a middle, and an end. Okay? No one wants to hear the story that just, goes off and then just stops in the middle, right? There's a reason that movies come to a climax and then come to an end in the very end. There's a reason that they have to come to a point where you feel comfortable leaving the movie theater because you feel like that story is complete. And so good stories have beginning, middles, and ends. And this is our basic story arc. So typically in any book or movie or where we're going to talk about video games, you have this idea of this rising action and that things are growing and the story is growing. And then they get to this point where everything is in conflict. There has to be some kind of conflict. And this is your climax of the story. And then we get to the falling action where the climax is beginning to get to some form of resolution. And when we get to that resolution, we feel better, the story is complete, and this is your standard basic story arc. Okay. But in virtual reality, the story arc is more like this. It's in first person. And we're going to talk about perspective and how we deal with the perspective. But we have to figure out how we translate a story like that into something that works in a medium like this. And then when you take off the headset, you remember it like this, that it was this magical, wonderful, or at least somewhat engaging, and you remember it in a way that continues to maintain a memory in your mind. And that's our goal, is to engage an audience in a way that they remember the story that we are telling them. So some of the elements of story It consists of a narration of events or a telling of the events. Okay. It consists of actions that are carried out by characters. Okay, so we've got to have people, we got to have a protagonist, we've got to have these different elements. It includes people in most cases. Now, sometimes those are robots, but they're personified. But we've got to have some type of characters. And then there really needs to be a conflict. The worst movies in the world are the ones that have no conflict. And so we as humans, for some reason, we love drama, we love conflict, and we've got to have something. Now, my wife loves Hallmark movies, and she's probably watching one right now while I'm recording this. And they also have characters and they have conflict. Not conflict that is super dramatic and leading to death, but conflict among the two characters and their story that they have been building up during those stories. But we can tell stories in lots of different ways. And this is where we get into the idea of what is the narrative. We've seen narratives throughout history. In the Odyssey, it had its own logic and its own way of telling this story. It basically created its own reality. And as any narrative, it has to have a reality about it. It has to have something that makes sense. It's a basic of rules and laws and how it acts. And in most cases, we do that here on Earth with our own gravity and our own states of nature and kind of all of these things that we already understand in our mind, and stories are built on top of that. Well, when the Odyssey was written, a lot of things had to be created in that story for people to understand it. And this gets to the essence of how people learn and remember. You see, our minds use all of these moments in time, and we create memories because we store them in narrative stories. We store them in a way that helps us to remember them. Our mind is made up of so many different elements and so much time and so much input that comes in. The only way we can make sense of it is if we are building a story, and that's how our mind works. And so if our mind naturally understands and remembers stories, then we are naturally understand and enjoy and engage with the concept of stories. We've seen this throughout history. Here's another example of when people looked at the stars. How did they know where the stars were? How did they remember them? We have constellations, and they built stories around those, and they told stories, and people remembered them, and that's how they navigated. And people could comprehend that in a way that was not just a whole bunch of dots, but it had meaning, and that was through story. So I've mentioned story and I've mentioned narrative, and I've kind of gone back and forth between the two. But the key I want you to get about the difference between story and narrative is that the narrative is the way you tell it. To the writer, the storyteller, they choose a series of events and they choose the order of which to deliver those. They can deliver those chronologically. They could deliver them through a specific perspective of an individual. They can flash back and forth between them. But how they tell that story is really the narrative that they are crafting. So you can imagine there could be two people attending the same event and could be telling the same story of what happened at that event, but be telling it in two very different ways. So let's take an example from one of my favorite Tar Heels, Andy Griffith. So that story was humorous, and it was humorous because it presented it from a different perspective, from the perspective of someone who did not know what they were getting into. So you had this kind of questioning of what's coming next. And it was a really interesting way and a creative way to tell a story of an event that happens over and over and has for 100 years. And so this is really an interesting way of telling his narrative about a football game. Good narratives turn story into information or into knowledge that the recipient, the audience member, can remember. Okay. Narrative is therefore responsible for how the recipient also perceives the story. So if we tell the story in one way, One audience member might receive it in a different way than we intended it, or a different audience member might hear it a third or different way. So how we present it is really important in how the story is perceived. So let's break down a story that we all know that we can talk about what is the true narrative here. So we're going to look at The Lion King. Hopefully you watched this as a child or even growing up and even as an adult. And so we're going to get into The Lion King. Think about that moment when you have the circle of life and all the animals come and we get to meet the new prince. The Simba is presented to everyone and we can visually see that he is going to be the future of these animals of this land. And then he meets his father, tells us and gives us a sense of place. He sets up the setting and tells us about Pride Rock and what all the parts, everything the light touches, as he says. And so you are introduced to the character, but you're also introduced to the place. But it also sets up that there's a dark area, that there's this other part of this world that is not so bright. And here comes our villain. We always have a villain. Well, not always, but in this case we do. Scar. Scar is the brother who is not king and wishes that he could be, and ultimately we find out that he kills his father, Simba's father, Mufasa. And so there's this really sad moment that when my kids were seeing this when they were young, we made sure we skipped over this part because the whole killing of the father is not something I enjoy. And so, but anyway, this is a big part of the story. And this is a horrible moment, but one that emotionally resonates with people. And so then Simba thinks it's his fault and he leaves and goes on this journey and it has this coming of age story. And so he meets some friends, we have some new characters, and we are able to tell the story of him growing up and learning a different side of life than he saw when he was as the prince. Well, back in the Pride Land, it is no longer the beautiful place that we saw before. Things are not that good. Things have changed. The hyenas have taken over. Nothing is there to hunt. The land is just barren, and things are not going well. So the climax is rising. We see this issue, and then ultimately word gets back to Simba. He has this moment where he has to decide what he's going to do, and then ultimately he chooses to go take on Scar. So we have this story, it's built. Now we have the climax here of the big fight and battle scene, and it's dramatic and it happens and there's a fire. And so everything is really dramatic to the point where we get to this wonderful resolution where everything is going to go back to normal. That Simba will now be king, that the land is going to come back, and we have this wonderful story that's all packaged up nice and neatly. Now, that is one way to tell that story. There is another way to tell that story. And you could think of many ways to tell that story. But what they actually did, Disney decided to go along with this. And so if you think about The Lion King 2.5, they basically told it from Timon and I forgot his name. The guy on screen right there, Pumbaa and Timon. He told from their perspective, right? And so they just changed the perspective of the way the story was told. You could also tell it in flashback, right? And you could give it a different time setting and you can play around with how you present the information. And so there are several different ways to tell this story. But as we look at virtual reality, we really have to also look at video games. Video games are interactive stories, and some of the best video games have great storylines and great narrative stories that are unique to each player. So when you play Hollow, excuse me. So when you play Halo or you play Minecraft or any of these other games, there are lots of stories and characters that build. Some of them are unique to each player, and some of them are unified across the entire game for all the players. So when we play in a VR world or in a game world, we have to have a setting and characters, which is traditional to any other story. But then we also have to have these laws or rules that are part of the life of which we are creating. So, for example, if we create something in space, we have to decide if there's gravity or not. Okay. But if we create something that looks like it's in on Earth, then people will automatically assume that there is gravity. We don't have to say there is X amount of gravity in this particular place. If it just looks like the real world, then they will assume everything is like the real world. They'll assume that there is wind. They will assume that they can't leap tall buildings, right? All of these things are just assumptions that people take in. But as we create these worlds, we can also change those. So if our introductory scene in the VR is in space and you see things floating, then you automatically assume that you can float. And so what we need to do as when we design these stories is we also have to design the laws or rules of life that go along with these stories. And then the last big part of a VR narrative is choosing a point of view. So first person point of view, third person point of view, and there's really this idea that in virtual reality there's really only one way to do this. And when I'm talking about point of view, we're talking about the choice that how we tell the story, from whose perspective do we see the story. But in virtual reality, there's really only one way to do that, and that's first person. Because we put on a headset and we are transported there, we are part of the story, and this is a really valuable piece of VR, is that we can take people to times and places that they couldn't go otherwise. And we let them imagine and be a part of it and to kind of join in and feel like they're a part of that story. So a lot of first-person shooter games are very similar to this, but it's not about the shooting part, but it's about being there and making it feel real. And so most VR games are from a first person's perspective. So as we build out our virtual reality stories, we're going to learn how to bring characters in, how to introduce characters, how to expand a character, how to develop that character, and how to help that character tell your story. We're going to learn how to build a place, how to build the setting of the scenes, and how we actually technically build those, but how we put in those details that really communicate what's important about the story and about the narrative and how we're going to tell it. A big part of virtual reality storytelling is sound and how we hear, and it's got to feel real. And the only way it's going to feel real is if it has the right sound. And then a big piece of VR is our ability to choose and control the world. So, how much agency do we give each player? And we'll talk about the value and ways that we can work to give agency or choices to our players. So, for the next several weeks, we're going to learn a lot about storytelling in VR and building on all of these key concepts.